What will your Halloween look like? I hope you don't plan on spending it like the characters from today's scary stories. Answer the question in the comment. Don't forget to subscribe and like. It will help us to bring you more scarier stories possible. Halloween is illegal in my hometown. We have a very different tradition instead. Yeah, it's true. Halloween and all things associated with it are entirely forbidden in my hometown. Now, before you go chucking pumpkin spice lattes at me and typing hocus pocus quotes in all caps, hear me out. There was a very good reason for this. I grew up in a small town near Phoenix, AZ, though I can't say which one for reasons I'll get into later. Many years ago, Halloween was celebrated just like it is everywhere else. Kids trick or treating, costume parties, autumn leaves bristling in the tranquil wind, and that poignant, spooky atmosphere that so many adore. However, all of that changed on Halloween night of 1983. It was a normal holiday by most accounts, but what most were blissfully unaware to at the time is what became of dear old Mabel Hannifin. Mabel was a kind woman in her early 80s, a widow who spent most of her days tending to her garden. Halloween was one of her favorite times of the year, as she loved getting the visits from children and spoiling them with sugary goodies. It was her own personal tradition to plop a nice, juicy, red, delicious apple in along with the candy she gave out, in hopes that the children wouldn't indulge themselves too greatly. That night was the last time anyone ever saw her. It was discovered 3 days later by a neighbor that Mabel hadn't been seen in quite some time. Police did a welfare check and found no trace of the woman. Her 2 pet beagles were near starvation, but luckily, they were discovered in time to make a full recovery. The same cannot be said for poor Mabel, however. Multiple interviews with parents escorting their children that evening, and even some with children themselves, reported nothing out of the ordinary. Many of them attested to having visited Mabel's home, and she seemed as cheery as ever. No one had seen or heard anything of real interest, and there were no signs of struggle or injury inside Mabel's home. None of her extended family around the country had heard anything from her either. It was as if the woman had just vanished off the face of the earth. We were all saddened by the news, but time went on, and people got on with their lives. Before long, the next Halloween arrived. The usual festivities began once more, and a troubling pattern first emerged. There was another local woman named Jessica Marshall who was home alone that night. She and her husband, David, had just been married a few months prior, and his work as a landscape surveyor had him away from the house that evening. David was a wealthy and also paranoid person. He had installed a security system to protect his home and wife while he was away. He later admitted that the actual reason he did this was to make sure his wife wasn't cheating on him while he was away, but regardless, it wasn't enough to save her. Once more, that night was the last time anyone ever saw Jessica. It didn't take David long to notice, and soon after he contacted the local police in a panic. Just like with Mabel, the police were unable to find any incriminating pieces of evidence at the scene, nor were they able to find any trace of Jessica's whereabouts. The only thing in the house that seemed to indicate anything strange was the spilled bowl of Halloween candy. Police sat down with David and reviewed the tapes manually soon after. They quickly found something odd, but it was not what they expected. It was 10:17 that evening, and the once bustling streets had since fallen relatively still as the trick-or-treaters returned home to gorge on their treats. That was when 2 figures were seen approaching the door of Jessica and David's house. One of them was dressed as a pumpkin, and the other as a scarecrow. From their voices and stature, it was determined they were both children between the ages of 8 and 11, 1 girl and 1 boy. Jessica answered the door, dressed in pajamas, and greeted them much as she had with dozens of other kids that same night. Trick or treat. The children both spoke in unison. with a tone that seemed devoid of the excitement exhibited by other kids previous. Jessica complimented their costumes and turned to fetch the bowl of candies. The children remained completely motionless as Jessica turned away. She returned a moment later, clutching the bowl in hand. "You guys are out pretty late tonight, huh?" Jessica reached out towards them, but paused as she seemed to notice that neither of them were carrying candy buckets or bags. Are you going to be able to carry these?" The children just held out their hands and said nothing. Jessica hesitated, but then reached towards them slowly. "Are your parents with you?" Jessica asked, dropping the candies into their outstretched hands. "No, we're alone," the boy replied. "Are you lost? Do you need me to call them?" Jessica asked, and the little boy in the scarecrow costume nodded. "Okay. Do you know their Can we come in?" The girl spoke, interrupting Jessica. She appeared a bit taken aback by the question and recoiled a bit in the doorway. She was seen locking eyes with the young girl for several seconds before finally replying, Sure. You can wait here while I call them." Jessica then gestured the two children inside, and the door closed behind them. That door remained shut until David came home the following day at around 6 p.m. There were never any screams or sounds of a fight, and the children were never seen exiting the house from any of the several security cameras. Police scoured the house with a team of watchdogs, but they found nothing. No trace of Jessica or the children. The only thing out of sorts was the spilled bowl of candies on the ground. Just like Mabel exactly 1 year previous, no one ever saw or heard from Jessica again. David was regarded as a prime suspect for both cases until his completely distraught nature, solid alibi, and lack of unifying evidence all but exonerated him from both. Tragically, David took his own life in the following months, unable to cope with the loss of his wife. The next year was when shit really hit the fan, though, as 3 others were declared missing: Mark Kemper, Alison Voss, and Lydia Kaminsky, all taken from separate locations, and all believed to have vanished within minutes of one another. Police had started to suspect that there was some kind of highly elaborate human trafficking ring going on that used the children as bait. Unlike the previous 2 years, however, this time there was a witness. Kelsey Bergman was at first incredibly reluctant to come forward, but reassurance from her parents and police desperation prodded her into an interview. She looked petrified when they brought her in, with deep pits under her eyes and behavior akin to those who have suffered an immensely traumatic experience. Kelsey was 17 at the time and was home alone that night when someone rang the doorbell. Kelsey got up, thinking it was just more trick-or-treaters. She opened the door and found 2 children waiting patiently on the front step, 1 girl and 1 boy. She says the little girl was dressed as a witch, while the boy was dressed in a skeleton outfit. She said they appeared soaking wet, but showed no concern, despite the sub-zero temperatures. Kelsey then noticed their eyes were entirely black, devoid of pigmentation of any kind. "Trick or treat?" They both spoke once again in unison, and once again without any sort of emotional inflection. Kelsey gave them candy, and the girl asked if they could come inside because they were cold. Kelsey said that was when the red flags started waving in her mind, and she was suddenly very uncomfortable with the situation. Instead of allowing them in, Kelsey gave them a few towels and phoned the police. That decision probably saved her life. For the 20 minutes it took for an officer to arrive, Kelsey said the children did nothing but stare at her through the front window. She doesn't think they blinked even once. Before the officer arrived, however, the children just walked away, back out into the night. Kelsey called out to them, trying to get them to wait in case they were actually just some lost kids, but the 2 did not respond. She didn't even know what to tell the police officers when they finally showed up. It was a strange account, and not all were so quick to believe it. Nevertheless, it was a break for the police, who took it and ran with it. Despite their efforts, very little progress was made. By this point, The town had caught wind of everything that was going on. They demanded answers and closure to the bizarre string of cases. People were really starting to get nervous. In what had to be one of the worst PR decisions of all time, the police chief admitted they were still investigating and without a prime suspect, or even a real motive. Many people in the town then turned on them, with some even whispering that the cops themselves were in on it. In a desperate bid to calm the tensions and prevent further incidents, the mayor pulled an unprecedented move. He said that for the safety of the community, they would implement a curfew each night on October 31st and an outright ban on parties, costumes that conceal the face, and the act of trick or treating. And just like that, Halloween became illegal. The town hall in which this all took place was met with a stunned silence. All in attendance seemed dumbfounded that they had actually suggested banning a holiday to try and stop the disappearances. None were very happy with the compromise, but they reluctantly held to it for the safety of their families. The next Halloween may have been the worst of all. No one went missing this time, but more sightings of the children were reported, dozens more. That was just the beginning, though. There was an immense storm that night. Thunder and lightning crashed while a torrential wind pounded the city. All throughout the night, people reported seeing shadows outside their homes and hearing whispers from their closets, basements, and attics. It's hard to say how much of that is true and how much was the result of a petrified town with wild imaginations. However, the things they found the next day were beyond dispute. Main Street was covered by thousands of dead birds of many different species. Many blamed the storm for being responsible, despite the fact that some of the breeds had never been recorded in the area. Some were never even identified. A young boy, Carson Ruse, was found mutilated, folded up, and crammed inside the trunk of an old oak tree. People reported sightings of a large, black dog-like creature, with piercing red eyes roaming the woods at night. Days later, a baby was born with a severe birth defect. Its head was malformed and almost elongated like that of a jackal. There were also odd growths upon its shoulder blades, complete with accompanying tendons and muscle tissue. The infant only survived for a few hours, but many thought the growths looked almost like wings. Police were at a loss, and on the brink of riots they called an assembly to address the increasingly horrifying incidents. Many in town spoke their piece, with the majority focusing their ire upon the authorities who had failed to stop these events. Our town was the old-school religious type, and many believed it had been cursed by God. The police chief reaffirmed that Halloween would remain illegal and that he would double efforts and resources to uncover the truth behind what was going on. The audience fell into a stunned silence until a low, grumbling chuckle emerged from the back row. "That won't stop it," the voice of a man called out. All in attendance turned back to see him rise to his feet amidst the crowd. He was a tall man, slender, with fierce black eyebrows and a slight grin that seemed to be perpetually stapled to his face. "And who are you?" one of the council members asked, speaking the question that all had on their minds. The tall man smirked and introduced himself as Atticus Stone. He claimed he was a soothsayer, and he had been guided by dreams to help the town in their time of crisis. Now most people would scoff at the mere suggestion of what he would go on to claim, but our community was a deeply religious one. Some might even venture to say a deeply gullible one as well. Mr. Stone claimed the gates of hell had cracked open, and all manner of foul things had begun to escape from the abyss. He said it was the beginning stages of the rapture, and there was no longer any sense in praying to God, as he would not help us. He mentioned something about how that would break a certain oath, but didn't elaborate further. Someone asked who the black-eyed children were, but Mr. Stone gave only a cryptic response. The lost ones. People were scared, and prepared to believe and do anything if it meant keeping themselves and their families safe. Trust in the police and church plummeted to an all-time low, as the odd occurrences refused to relent. and slowly but surely people turned to advice from the strange Meister Atticus stone. Stone professed that there was in fact a way to keep people safe during these turbulent times, but doing so required some alterations in tradition. He first instructed people to mount a signet upon the front door. It was some odd, hieroglyphic-looking crest or coat of arms, with two identical symbols in the center that looked like mirrored number 3s. If the two threes were pushed inward, they would form an 8, or perhaps an inverted infinity symbol. I didn't know at the time if that was important, but before long I began to see the symbol hanging on the doors of many houses in the town. Some saw this action as witchcraft, but Stone countered their accusations. He said it was not demons that we would pray to for protection, but instead an angel of the rapture. He explained that this particular angel held a great deal of power and was feared by all things wretched and devious. He gave it no direct name and referred to it only as the lurker in red. Stone then spoke of a new holiday that was to be conducted every year in October. Most people in the town now call it Hell Month, but Stone had a different name for it, Atonapatromus, Atonaputramus. And no, that's not a Harry Potter spell. I already checked. It is a month-long festival of sorts, which has now been going on for 32 years. The first 15 days of the month are known as the time of blood. People are instructed to fight, cut themselves, and generally just be a dick to anyone, and everyone they came in contact with. There is also to be no weddings, birthday parties, or celebrations of any kind during this time. Even funerals are strictly forbidden. If someone happened to kick the bucket, then they would just have to be stuffed in the freezer until the allotted time was up. And that actually happened too, not the freezer part. But the time of blood seems to coincide with a lot of heartache in the town. There is always a spike in suicides, domestic abuse, and assaults during that period. It may just be coincidence or heightened stress, but my grandfather did pass away during that time as well. The next 15 days of the month are basically the exact opposite of the first. It is known as the time of flesh, and it is a celebration with parties, dancing, and all the intoxicants you can get your hands on. People are encouraged to drink, take drugs, have sex, and indulge in any and all pleasures they can possibly think of. It started off tame for the first few years, but in time it almost became a sort of Mardi Gras for us. Nowadays it's not uncommon to see large street parties, opium dens, and moonlight orgies with dozens of participants. The degeneracy seemed to creep slowly and corrupt the people in town as the years went by. Former members of the church succumbed to the hedonism, and generally well-respected individuals began to indulge their deviant fantasies. I won't lie, I very much enjoyed this holiday growing up. The first half of the month sucked, but the rest was essentially just one giant party. The event is oddly cathartic in a way that I've never been able to replicate with anything else in life. It's almost as if the contrast of immense pain at the beginning of the month made the pleasures at the end infinitely more enjoyable. The last day of the month is reserved for the most important event of all, the time of silence. Every October 31st, in place of Halloween, people in the town return to their homes, extinguish all the lights, and sleep in the same room as one another. No one is to step foot outside the house between the hours of 10 p.m. and 4 a.m. for any purpose whatsoever. Those that have defied this rule have yet to be seen ever again. I remember those nights most vividly of all, not only because I was finally sober after a 2-week-long bender, but because of the sounds. Turns out the time of silence didn't always live up to its namesake. Sure, it was quiet most of the night, dead silent as a matter of fact, but every now and then you'd hear an agonized scream in the distance, or animalistic snarls outside. God only knows what truly was happening on those nights, but honestly, I hope I never find out. The day we started listening to Atticus Stone was the day God truly abandoned our town. My father told me that once before he passed. He never wanted to talk about the tradition, but that night he was drunk enough to not restrict his tongue. I now wish I would have talked to him about it more. Stone made all of the citizens swear themselves to secrecy and vowed to hunt down any who spilled his secrets to the outside world. Doesn't exactly bode well for me, but I've lived my life in fear of him and what he brought to our town. I won't live in fear anymore, come whatever may. For these reasons, I'm guessing none of you have ever heard of this strange tradition. Apparently Stone and his minions are pretty good at keeping secrets regarding what they're up to, but that's only half of it. See, the weirdest thing about Stone's plan was that it actually seemed to work. Ever since the town has adopted the tradition, things have gotten a lot better. No more unexplained disappearances, sightings of obsidian-eyed children or other cryptids. Heck, even the property value has gone up. The town is booming in trade and has grown wealthy beyond expectation in the last few years. It's almost as if it's all too good to be true, which of course is how I first began thinking that it is. Turns out we might have really screwed things up. That's actually the reason I'm here telling this story now. You have to understand, when this all began, I was very young and, well, stupid. Sure, it was odd at first, but we all just sort of got on with life after things began improving. What I'm trying to say is that it's very difficult to recognize a cult for what it is when you're already in it. I finally moved away from the town a couple years after high school. It took only a few mentions of our hometown tradition to friends and subpar co-workers for me to really begin contemplating my entire upbringing. That's when I really got curious about the whole thing. I started researching, and after months of searching, I finally found that strange symbol that we hang on our doors. It was in a place I really didn't want it to be either, an old book on voodoo and the occult. This symbol is closely associated with a familiar-sounding entity, the lurker in red. It has another name too, but most strongly advise against speaking it or even writing it. Apparently, that's a good way to catch its attention, which is something you don't really want if you're not prepared. Names hold a great deal of power. This deity or force, or whatever it is, has qualities associated primarily with vengeance, wrath, and war. Sounds like a nice guy, huh? Strangely enough, though, it is also associated with things like protection, family, and even the well-being of children. It's like if you mixed Rambo with Mary Poppins, and then gave it supernatural abilities. There are a multitude of rituals and seances to gain favor with this being. It was a lengthy list, but one of them caught my eye and manifested an amorphous pit of dread in my gut as I read it. As it turns out, this holiday that we've been performing for the past 32 years is actually more like a ritual designed to invoke the favor of the lurker in red. For me, the realization that my hometown had been performing an occult ritual for over 30 years and utilizing the power of some eldritch creature was troubling enough, but then I saw the other stories online, and the pieces finally came together. I'm willing to bet you've seen them too. Accounts posted on Reddit and other forums detailing someone's encounter with children whose eyes were entirely black. Most of the time, the children would behave in unsettling ways and ask the potential victim to let them inside. I'm sure a lot of these tales are just fiction by this point, but many people swear by their accounts, and those are the ones I'm worried about. The thing is, I always assumed this phenomenon was isolated to our strange little town, and I think at one point it actually was. I don't think Atona Petromus was actually banishing them to hell, as Stone claimed. I think it just drove them elsewhere. Worse still, it might have actually exacerbated the problem. I have reckoned with this knowledge for the past decade at least, a horrible truth which has all but consumed my life. For those that may lambast me for not speaking sooner upon it, I wouldn't blame you. Truth is that I'm afraid not only of what Atticus Stone and his cohorts may do once they find out I expose their secrets, but also of that thing they worship. This year marks the 33rd year of Atona Patromus, and I think that is significant. 33 is a number with a great many interesting qualities. The highest rank attainable in Scottish Rite Freemasonry is the 33rd degree. The Grand Orient de France of Freemasonry was founded in 1733. In 1933, Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, and the United States added the Masonic Great Seal inscribed with the Latin words "For New World Order" onto the dollar bill. Harry S. Truman, a 33rd degree Freemason, became the 33rd President of the United States and dropped the nuclear bombs upon Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which straddled the 33rd longitudinal parallel. Many interesting locations with paranormal histories also lie along parallel 33, including Jerusalem, Roswell, New Mexico, the Bermuda Triangle, the Pyramids of Giza. Some also believe Atlantis and the Garden of Eden were once located somewhere within the 33rd parallel. JFK was assassinated at the 33rd parallel, as was David Koresh, a cult leader killed at 33 years old. There have been many tragedies along the 33rd parallel, and I suggest looking into it for yourself, as there's no way I can list them all. Numerology lists several traits associated with the number 33, including enlightenment, conscious ascension, and spiritual birth. Many cultures and religions also place great significance upon the number as well. The Vedic religion of the Anglo-Indian tribes had 33 deities. The second level of Buddhist nirvana is called Trayastrimsa, which translates to belonging to the 33 devas. Islamic prayer beads generally have 33 beads, which correspond to their various names of God. The Christian Bible may hold the most references of all, though. The rule of King David in Jerusalem lasted 33 years. It is said that Jesus Christ performed a total of 33 miracles throughout the Gospels. He was then crucified in year 33 AD at the age of 33. Mount Hermon lies at 33 degrees longitude and 33 degrees latitude, and is said to be the place where the Nephilim first descended to earth. The final book of the Bible, Revelation, also seems to revere the number. 333 is half the number of the beast who is said to arise in the era of the rapture. The beast is said to devour 1/3 of the stars in the sky and annihilate 1/3 of all life on earth, or approximately 33.33%. The beast has many different names, including the Great Dragon, the Lie of Lies, but most interesting for our purposes, the Lurker in Red. Now all of this may just be vague coincidence, and I'll be the first to admit that I don't know what it is all supposed to mean. I just find it rather poetic that our town lies near Phoenix, Arizona. A phoenix is a mythical bird creature engulfed by flames, something that would have been depicted as a red spirit who lurks in the skies. The crest which decorates the doors of my hometown also bear the inverted 33, as if it has to mean something. Oh, and can you guess what longitude our town lies on? Smack dab in the middle of the 33rd parallel. I know it all sounds crazy and probably like conspiratorial nonsense, for which there is no real basis at this point. I may have just overanalyzed the hell out of all of this, but I just can't help but feel there is something more to this. If you know anything about the Freemason philosophy, you'll know that numbers are of great importance. Nothing they do is a coincidence. It is all supposed to mean something. What that is exactly, I don't know. And in regards to the black-eyed children and everything else, I'm still not sure how it all connects. I still don't know what they want, how they can do the things they do, or even what they actually are. I do know one thing, though. They're still out there. Like I said at the beginning, I don't want to ruin anyone's fun. I know that many people absolutely love this time of year, and I wouldn't want to take that away from them. I just think it's important for you all to be aware of the things that are truly out there. So when the big night comes, and you're all dressed up as Clifford the big red dog, or a sexy version of a spatula or something, just keep an eye out. There's going to be a lot of trick-or-treaters out that night, and some of them may have eyes that look a little too dark. Whatever you do, just do not let them inside your house. There's no telling how many there are now, or where they've gone. But I've got an odd feeling that we haven't seen the last of them. Stay safe out there. There was a reason why my neighbor's Halloween decorations always looked so realistic. I absolutely used to love Halloween, not only dressing up as my favorite scary character, making horror-themed food, or putting up decorations. No, I loved the atmosphere that filled our neighborhood as it changed from its boring demeanor into something horrifying and exciting. My neighbor and best friend Mark was an even bigger fanatic than myself. Each year he'd tried to make the best costume or scariest decoration, but despite our best efforts at becoming the Halloween kings, we could never match up to Mr. Black. Mr. Black was a man of advancing age. He'd been widowed about a decade earlier, left behind by a vicious, evil wife that treated the entire neighborhood like crap. The only thing she ever loved was Halloween, and she'd make damn sure all the attention was directed at herself each year on October 31st. When she died, I almost felt relieved for the poor man. Still, for reasons beyond my comprehension, he decided to keep his abusive wife's tradition alive. Each year he'd come up with the most gruesome display of nightmare-inducing decoration. His entire house would be transformed into one of absolute, mind-bending horror. He'd build a pool of blood in his garden, or he'd cover the entire house with cobwebs, unleashing a horde of spiders just to prove that he could. It was as beautiful as it was disgusting. How he constantly managed to outdo himself brought great joy to the rest of the neighborhood. Unfortunately, Mark couldn't stand it. He's a damn attention seeker. Always has to be in the spotlight every fucking Halloween. For years, Mark had tried to outdo Mr. Black. He'd spend thousands of dollars in preparation, planning for months ahead of time, only to be blown out of the water by Mr. Black. What was even weirder was that each time, it would only take Mr. Black a day to set everything up, which enraged Mark beyond anything else in life. In 2017, Mark even resorted to renting animatronics that resembled crawling corpses. He littered his yard with the things, letting them scream and pull themselves around. He was so confident that year. And even as the 30th of October rolled around, Mr. Black still hadn't put up any decorations. When we went to work the next day, on Halloween itself, Mark was beyond himself with joy. He'd finally done it, and he just wouldn't shut up about it. It wasn't until we got home later that day, before we saw the horrors taking place in Mr. Black's front yard. In the span of 8 hours, he'd turned it into a literal graveyard. Muffled screams were coming up from the ground, with bells that were attached to strings leading into buried coffins. They rang as people gathered around in awe from the sight. Those brave enough to traverse his yard were invited inside for a tour. Mark and I joined, and quickly realized that Mark's pathetic animatronics were nothing in comparison. Because inside the living room, Mr. Black had created a makeshift morgue, full on with mortuary refrigerators that rumbled around as if people were trapped inside. Mark was pissed. He couldn't believe it, and to be fair, neither could I. He swore then that he'd figure out how the hell Mr. Black managed to pull off these incredible feats each and every year, at such an advancing age and without any help. How does he do it? Have you ever seen any trucks or workmen outside his house? Mark asked. I chuckled. Nah, but come on. He's retired. He probably gets it done while we're at work. Still, Mark didn't believe it. That guy's up to something. Next year I'm going to stay at home and figure it out. A year passed, and Mark actually remained true to his word. On the 31st of October, 2018, he called in sick to work. I sighed once I found out, surprised at how seriously he was taking it. Then, at around noon, I got a frantic and excited voice message from Mark. I knew it. I freaking knew it. You won't believe what I just found. Mr. Black is a depraved monster. I'm going to call the... The voice message was cut short, so I tried to call back. No response. After the fifth or so missed call, I started to get worried. There was absolutely no way Mark would have given me any peace. If he'd truly found something, but no matter how many times I tried to call him, I just got a busy signal. By the end of the workday, I was truly scared for him. Mark was never that silent. I needed to figure out what was going on. As soon as I returned home, I went over to Mark's place, where I proceeded to hammer on his door. His wife was the one to answer, and she too seemed worried. Elise, is Mark here? She frowned. He went out to run some errands a few hours ago, but I haven't heard from him since. I thought maybe his phone died, but he should have been back home by now. Mark hadn't told her about his plan to investigate Mr. Black, mostly because she would have been pissed, but I had to come clean. If he was truly missing, we needed to call the police, while Elise explained the situation to the cops. I went over to talk to Mr. Black myself. It was already getting late. Both children and adults had gathered in front of his house, ready for the yearly tour of horror. That year, his yard had been turned into a field of tall grass. It was so dense we could hardly see his front door. All we could see amid the field were makeshift scarecrows. Mr. Black hadn't let anything go to waste. As we entered his yard, the air filled with the stench of rotting flesh. It wasn't unusual for him to utilize all 5 senses, but this was extreme. Mr. Black, do you have a moment? I asked. In a minute, old friend. After the tour, he just shouted back as he led the people inside his home. I remained outside, disturbed by the odd smell. I moved some of the grass apart to inspect the scarecrows. They were horrifying, covered in old rags with bits and pieces of skin visible through the holes. They didn't even look like props. After a moment of hesitation, I reached out to pull off the scarecrow's mask. What I saw sent me falling to the ground in shock. That scarecrow wasn't a prop, nor a doll. It was an actual corpse. Oh God, was all I managed to get out as I stared at the decomposing body. Once I'd partially regained my senses, I started checking the other scarecrows. Most of them were beyond rotten, skeletal corpses that had perished long ago. But once I reached the last one, I immediately recognized the clothes. With a trembling hand, I reached to take off the mask. It was Mark. His throat had been slit, and he'd been turned into a flesh-filled scarecrow. I stood before the body of my former best friend in shock. All these years, Mr. Black had created what seemed like impossibly realistic decorations. It had all been real. The blood, the cadavers, the screaming. We'd all been oblivious to it. The police arrived shortly after, alerted by Mark's wife. They quickly stormed the house and escorted all the guests outside, but Mr. Black himself was gone. He was never seen again. I don't celebrate Halloween anymore, nor does anyone else in my neighborhood. For us, the 31st of October is just a painful memory of what we let happen under our noses. But if you see a new neighbor with decorations that seem just a tad too realistic, stay away from them. It might be Mr. Black. When we were kids, my little brother died on Halloween. He's come back to visit me every year since his death. Jimmy returned for the first time exactly 1 year after the accident. I was home alone. Dad was at the bar and Mum was dead. We'd crammed her into a pine box and shipped her off to the incinerator months ago. I'd been sitting on the couch watching a plump cockroach scuttle across the coffee table sipping whiskey that I'd liberated the previous night after Dad passed out. I wasn't quite drunk yet. At 11 years old, my tolerance to alcohol was comparable to most local stumblebum drunks. A knock came to the door, the gentle tap of brittle knuckles upon rotted wood. I paused with the rim of the bottle resting against my lips. Even the cockroach cocked its long antennae curiously toward the door. The local trick-or-treaters knew better than to come here seeking candy. Our ramshackle abode was always one DHS visit away from being condemned, and the cobwebs and sundry creepy crawlies in our front windows certainly weren't decorative. I reflexively choked out a sob when I opened the door and saw his ghostly form. The sheet draped over him was stained brown and soaked with stinking river water. "Jimmy?" I asked, my voice croaking in disbelief. As if to answer me, his jaw fell slack, and I heard the tiniest groan emerge from under that sheet, like a whining door hinge in a quiet house. He raised his hand to me, and I shrank back in fear, expecting him to thrust an accusatory finger and damn me as a liar and murderer. Instead, I realized that he was holding his hand open, expecting something. A dry, throaty sound whistled up from his slackened jaw, and I suddenly understood what he wanted. My little brother had come back for his favorite holiday. I rushed up to my bedroom, reached under my bed, and grabbed Jimmy's pumpkin-shaped Halloween bucket. I flicked off the roaches and shook out mouse shit, then ran back to the front steps, where my little brother was waiting. As Jimmy snatched his candy bucket from me, I saw them, watching us from the corner. It was the same group of older bullies that harassed us last year, on the night of the accident. Last time they'd been wearing clown masks. They chose the Power Rangers this year. Despite their masks, I could tell that those bullies didn't quite believe what they were seeing. Jimmy had been presumed dead for a year, yet here he was, wearing the very same costume they'd seen him wearing on the night he went missing. I'd had a growth spurt since that night. Rage and self-hatred did wonders for a growing boy's physique. Fueled by whiskey and a desperate urge to blame anyone other than myself for Jimmy's death, I charged them. Outnumbered 4-1, I took some shots, no doubt, but I routed them regardless, and I left one of them bleeding on the sidewalk, beaten nearly half to death. Then I returned to Jimmy, smiling, and hooked my pinky around his before we set off to celebrate Halloween. I sat on my couch, eyes trained on the flickering candle on my coffee table. The power had been out for a month, and I hadn't seen any good reason to turn it back on. I'd only be cutting into my meager booze budget, and besides, the city was kicking me out in a few days. The house had been bought and paid for by some long-dead relative, then passed down to my parents as an act of pity. When Dad finally kicked the bucket, he left the house to me, but I was never quite able to stay ahead of the property taxes. I wasn't going to miss the place. It wasn't exactly full of fond memories. At this time of night, I'd normally be blackout drunk, but tonight was Halloween, and I didn't want to miss Jimmy. My entire life might have amounted to a hill of shit, but I've promised to never let my little brother down again. I checked the time, 8 o'clock on the dot. I grabbed Jimmy's Halloween bucket and headed out front. Jimmy never did tell me why Halloween was his favorite holiday. He'd been a gentle kid, small for his age, fair-skinned and wispy. You wouldn't have known it to look at him, but he preferred the schlock and gore of October. Grindhouse horror movie marathons to kiddie fare more appropriate to his age. He never flinched at the scary parts when the reanimated undead wreaked havoc or dream demons emerged to slash open teenage throats. I'd never attributed his love of Halloween to something so cliché as donning a mask to pretend to be someone else, though I wouldn't have blamed him. No, I'd always suspected that Jimmy loved this time of year specifically, because it was when the world went dim and happily embraced the horrific. Vampires and possessed dolls and werewolves made more sense than the more abstract horrors we faced at home. Or shit, Maybe the kid just really liked candy. I stepped outside and the river wards were alive with grinning jack-o'-lanterns, windows glowing orange and framed with fake spider webs, and scores of yuppie parents leading their kids door to door. I spotted him walking slowly toward the house. I swore he got smaller every year. I waved to him. He didn't wave back, but he did cock his head slightly, as if he was struggling to remember who I was. As always, he was wearing the filthy sheet, soaked in river water. I felt a passing wave of revulsion and guilt when I glimpsed the faded bloodstains where the fabric hugged Jimmy's misshapen occipital. I smiled and offered him the bucket. Jimmy snatched it from my hand. Though there was only darkness within those crooked eye holes I'd cut into the sheet 25 years ago, somehow I knew that if he still had eyes, they'd have been gleaming. I reached down to his hand, hooked my pinky around his, and I took my little brother trick or treating, like I'd done every year since he first returned. This wasn't our neighborhood anymore. Sure, the names of the streets were the same, but that was about it. The yuppie influx, with the ensuing rent increases and property tax hikes, had squashed out most of the old guard. The newbies didn't care for the sturdy, century-old houses forged with brick and mortar. One by one, those stout homes were being flattened to make way for flimsier but more stylish facades. Soon our childhood home was going to suffer the same fate. Jimmy must have sensed that something was amiss because he tightened his pinky around mine, though I haven't heard his voice since that night by the river. His pinky squeeze said enough. It said, "I've got you." That was our private show of reassurance that helped sustain us through our childhood, when Mum wept at the dinner table as we split a dried hunk of welfare cheese for dinner. I'd give Jimmy a squeeze when Dad staggered home drunk and started laying into Mum. I joined Jimmy on his small twin mattress. We'd squeeze pinkies, eyes shut tight, with pillows over our ears so we wouldn't have to hear Dad's fist knocking against Mum's head. "I've got you." Tonight we stopped at every house that still had its lights on. Our new neighbors smiled awkwardly, genuinely troubled by the sight of the neighborhood drunk escorting a child in a raggedy ghost costume. I didn't give a shit what they thought as long as they tossed a few bite-sized Snickers bars into Jimmy's bucket. Soon the streets began to empty and the trick-or-treaters went home. One by one, those grinning jack-o'-lanterns went dark. Those orange window lights dimmed, and it was just Jimmy and I wandering the lonely streets. We headed back toward the house. This was where we would normally part ways, with Jimmy heading back on his own. Tonight, though, I remained at his side. He cocked his head again, curious. I squeezed his pinky. Though I loved Jimmy, he was still my little brother, and often I treated him as such. Just because I hated the neighborhood bullies didn't mean I didn't glean some pointers from their abuse. Sometimes I'd slap Jimmy around, or steal his toys because he'd annoyed me somehow. Other times I just wanted to feel stronger than someone else. The day of his death, Jimmy had put me in a particularly foul mood. Using the 5-fingered discount, I'd gotten comic books from the drugstore on York Street, and I was looking forward to thumbing through them. Jimmy came rushing into our bedroom, crying because the rats had gotten to his hand-me-down Jason Voorhees costume. The critters had gnawed through the plastic hockey mask and left the fake, blood-splattered overalls stinking like rat turds. I told him to take it up with Mom and Dad, but he said Mom was passed out and Dad was at the bar as usual. My mood instantly turned black, not necessarily because of Jimmy, but because once again I'd have to pick up the slack for our parents. I cooked most of Jimmy's meals. I scrubbed the stink off his clothes and got him ready for school every morning, while Mum and Dad were off, drunk and doped. All I'd wanted was a night to myself, curled up in bed with some stolen comic books, but they couldn't stay sober long enough to even give me that much. Somehow I kept my temper in check. I got him to stop sobbing by yanking the sheet off his bed, cutting out those mismatched eye holes and draping it over him. "There," I said. "You're a ghost now." His green eyes were visible through the holes in the sheet. His cheeks perked up under the sheet, and I could tell he was smiling. "Can you take me trick-or-treating?" he asked. No, I didn't want to, but I also didn't want him crying again, and Mum would have beaten the shit out of me if I let Jimmy wander the neighborhood alone. So we set out into the streets, amongst a legion of Ninja Turtles and Ghostbusters and Barbie dolls brought to life. Though it was simple, he enjoyed his makeshift costume. I was just hoping to get through the night without bumping into our enemies. That was certainly naive of me. It didn't take long for them to zero in on us. There were 4 of them, all older boys. Even the smallest one towered over me. They were wearing clown masks, thin plastic smiling, red-nosed clowns that filled my stomach with dread. None of the parents milling about with their kids noticed the brewing confrontation, not with the dozens of trick-or-treaters clogging the sidewalk. Jimmy clutched his candy bucket to his chest. One of the bullies reached for it, and that was when I snapped. I couldn't help it. I might have been pissed off at him for dragging me out here, but this was Jimmy's favorite night of the year. I couldn't watch some assholes ruin it for him. I swung hard, my fist connected with the bully's face, and I heard a loud crunch right before blood trickled down from behind the clown's visage. I grabbed Jimmy by the wrist and we took off into the throngs of costume kids. We rounded the next corner and disappeared into an alley. We hid there, holding our breath as the bullies sped past. There was no way they were going to let this go. 2 of them would likely roam the neighborhood looking for us, while the other 2 would lay in wait near our house. "What are we going to do?" Jimmy asked, voice quivering in fear. Every night, right before I black out, I think about how I should have just squeezed his pinky, but I didn't. Instead, I blamed him. We wouldn't have been in this trouble if he hadn't been such a crybaby back home. That was why, of the dozens of places we could have gone to hide, I chose the river, because I knew he was terrified of the river. Today, the Delaware riverfront was as gentrified as the rest of the neighborhood. A casino and towering condominiums loomed large, and quaint pedestrian walkways were infested with pop-up beer gardens. In our youth, the riverfront had been an industrial graveyard, dominated by long shuttered factories with stretches of wilderness between them. Stinking sumac trees swayed overhead, and plump river rats darted through the bushes. This wasn't the first time we had to hide back here. Jimmy always hated it. Although the neighborhood lay only a quarter mile to the west, Jimmy thought the riverfront was too isolated. He feared that if our bullies ever caught us here, they could kill us, and no one would ever know. My mood hadn't improved when we finally reached one of the piers, big grey concrete blocks jutting out 50 feet into the sloshing water, supported by a number of wood pilings underneath. Jimmy remained a few feet behind me, still in his costume, nervously gripping his Halloween bucket. The tide was coming in, and he jumped every time he felt a wave hit the pilings beneath us, as if the pier might collapse. But what scared Jimmy the most was the possibility of falling into the water, that those rough green-brown waves might trap him under the pier, where he'd come up for air and smash his face against unyielding concrete instead. "Can we just please try to go home?" he whined. "No," I snapped back. "Not unless you want those assholes to knock your teeth out." He lowered his head. "But I don't like it back here." Looking at my whimpering little brother, I lost all sense of empathy. After running scared from our bullies, I was eager to assert myself as an alpha. I yanked him toward the edge of the pier. "I'm so tired of you acting like a wimp," I snarled. I shoved him closer to the edge, where the water sloshed violently 10 feet below us. "There's nothing to be afraid of back here." "I just want to go home," he cried, the eye holes in the sheet now rimmed with tears. "Stop being such a pussy," I shouted, then instinctively gave him a stiff right hook to the shoulder. What happened next occurred within seconds, yet in my memory, it seems to play out for an eternity. I'd hit him harder than I meant to. Jimmy dropped his candy bucket, then, staggered as his shoes got caught in the pool of fabric underfoot. I watched in muted disbelief as he flopped over the pier, arms waving, right before the back of his head cracked against the concrete edge. There was a splash 10 feet beneath me, and my brother was gone, leaving behind nothing more than a red patch on the concrete and white bubbles breaking the water's surface. Pinkies locked, we maneuvered through condominium parking lots and empty beer garden stalls until we reached that old pier. For a moment, my memories blended with the present, and I saw myself, cold and shivering and soaked with river water, trudging back toward the neighborhood alone, clutching Jimmy's candy bucket. I remembered how cold and dark the river was when I dove in, fighting the waves, trying in vain to find my brother, before finally giving up. I never told anyone what happened. That night, when I got home, Mum was still passed out and Dad hadn't come back from the bar yet. I hid my wet clothes then, later, told them that Jimmy had simply run away from me. I was terrified of what would happen if they knew the truth. There was a police search that amounted to nothing. Dad didn't seem to care very much. Months later, Mum swallowed 40 sleeping pills and never woke up. I took to stealing swigs of Dad's half-empty liquor bottles to soothe my guilt, a habit that had served me ever since. But even that relief has proved fleeting. As Jimmy and I walked along the pier, I tightened my pinky around his, content to die sober. We stood at the edge of the pier. Though I couldn't see his face, I could tell that he was no less afraid of the river now than he had been 25 years ago. Jimmy stepped off the pier and disappeared into the water below. I wondered, once this pier was inevitably torn asunder to make way for a condo or another casino, would Jimmy still resurface on Halloween? If he did, and he ventured into the neighborhood, would he even recognize that the shiny new studio apartments were standing on the grave of our old house? Either way, I was going to make sure that he didn't go through it alone. I stepped off the pier, just like Jimmy had that night. I cracked the base of my skull against that concrete lip. A lightning flash of pain shot across the world, and I crashed hard into the water, pushed at once by the tide under the pier. A wave slammed me against one of the pilings, and I felt something snap in my back, and when I tried to scream, filthy river water filled my mouth. Yet, as I was thrashed about under the dock, my consciousness slowly fading, I felt Jimmy's tiny pinky finger squeezing around my own. "I've got you." That happened almost 1 year ago, last Halloween. Though I wanted nothing more than to slip into a watery slumber with my little brother, he must have felt otherwise. I woke up weeks later in a hospital. They removed patches of my skull to relieve the pressure from the brain bleed, courtesy of cracking my head on that concrete lip. My ribs had been shattered to splinters from the paramedics' vigorous chest compressions. They found me on the road, which meant Jimmy dragged me from the water, across the industrial wilderness, then out to the waiting blacktop. I asked the medics if there'd been a boy in a ratty ghost costume with me when they arrived. They said they hadn't seen one. Anyway, I'm writing this on the computer at the public library right off Girard Avenue, but I better finish up. The librarian is a real asshole. Doesn't like it when street bums like me stink up the joint. It's almost Halloween once again. Jimmy might not want me down in the water with him, but I'm going back to join him, regardless. I've got his candy bucket, so we can hit the neighborhood one last time. I've also got a box cutter with the sharpest goddamn razors I could find. Once Jimmy slips back into the water, I'm going to open myself up, both wrists, then my carotid artery, and I'm jumping into that green-blue Delaware shitwater right along with him, because I'm Jimmy's big brother, goddammit. I won't let him swim alone. "This is the corniest thing you've ever made us do," Ryan said, leaning on the faded wooden sign. Greta exhaled and almost laughed. The four of us were standing in front of Halloween Hamlet, a combination carnival, corn maze, and gift shop. To say the place was cheesy would be charitable. The rides were small and looked like they hadn't seen maintenance since the 90s. The corn maze looked like it was maybe 4 or 5 acres at most. At least the gift shop appeared to be pretty big. All in all, I guessed HH took up about a dozen acres of unused field just outside of town. "I can't believe you all dragged me out here on a Saturday for this hokey crap," Daria said. "This is the first year it's been here," Ryan said. "I don't know, I figured it might be a hidden gem or something." I tapped the sign Ryan was leaning on, and a chunk of worm-eaten wood fell off. "Maybe it should have stayed hidden," I said. "Where's your sense of adventure?" Greta asked, buckling on a fanny pack. "Let's go get lost in the maze. I brought snacks." We walked over to the ticket booth. It sat alone next to the corn maze entrance, like the last tooth in ruined gums. A few other groups milled about the parking lot and a small line had formed. It was early yet, and HH hadn't done much advertising, as far as I could tell. Leave it to Ryan to find any weirdness within a 100-mile radius. "Tom, did you remember to bring cash?" he asked. I made a show of patting my pockets before pulling out my wallet. "Tommy, if you cover my ticket, I'll buy you lunch," Daria promised. "I only brought my card." "Fine, but I'm also ordering dessert." We only had to wait in line for 5 minutes. When we reached the booth, I winced. The ticket seller was grinning at us, teeth shining with the overly white glare of bad veneers. Everything about the guy seemed fake. Bad spray tan, thick hair plugs. Even his skin appeared pinched and too tight, like he'd overdosed on Botox. It was impossible to tell if he was 30 or 60 years old. "Ladies and gentlemen," the ticket seller said in an accent I couldn't place, "welcome to Halloween Hamlet." We bought our tickets, the creepy dude staring at us the whole time. Before we could leave, he leaned in close and winked, then spoke to us in a conspiratorial whisper. "The gift shop and rides are on the other side of the corn maze. It shouldn't take more than 15 or so minutes to get through. Word of warning, though, if you cheat or try to take a shortcut through the maze, you'll all regret it." The ticket seller's grin dropped with the last line. I felt his eyes follow us as we walked into the corn maze, but when I looked back, he was already helping the next group. "Weird," Ryan muttered. "It's not like we even need to try hard to cheat. Heck, Tom, you're probably tall enough to peek over the corn on your tiptoes." "And skinny enough to be mistaken for a scarecrow," Greta added. "Keep it up. I'll lead you all to your doom." The 4 of us spent the next few minutes wandering around the crowded maze. Daria quickly became our unofficial navigator, ushering us past slow-moving families and making decisive turns. We all quickly became lost. "I don't want to rush anything," Greta said, "but I have to pee so bad, so bad." Ryan stopped. "Okay, it's been fun, but I'm calling it time to cut through the rows." I felt a slight flutter in my stomach. "Why don't we give it another few minutes?" 'Cause I'm about to wet myself, dude," Greta said, already poking at the corn stalks. "Which way do you think the bathrooms are?" "Well, judging by the budget of what we've seen so far, I'm guessing it's porta potties and not fresh ones," Ryan guessed. Daria shook her head and suddenly cut through the closest row. We followed. I brought up the rear. It was a tight fit weaving between the stalks. They seemed taller from inside the rows than when they were just bordering the maze. A cloud passed over the sun, dropping a cool shadow over the field. I shivered and kept my eyes on Ryan's red flannel shirt. We all joked he was cosplaying as a lumberjack lately. Ahead of him, I caught an occasional glimpse of Greta or Daria pushing through the corn. It was hard to tell which, since they both had black hair and similar white hoodies. The rows seemed to go on much farther than they should. Eventually, though, I stepped out from the corn into a clear space. My relief didn't last longer than it took me to look around. We were still inside the maze, only on a much wider path. "I think we got turned around," Ryan said. "We didn't," Daria said. It was a straight shot to get here. I guess the maze is bigger than it looks. Greta was stomping her feet. Okay, we're all good friends here. This can't wait. She disappeared into another row of cornstalks. Don't leave me, Greta yelled back. We won't, Daria replied. Promise? Just be quick and watch out for snakes. What? Rakes, Ryan yelled back after a few moments. Daria meant rakes. Cornfields are lousy with them this time of year. I hate you all. You shouldn't ow. I froze when I heard Greta shout. Hey, I was only kidding, Daria said, frowning. Look, don't mess with us. Greta came rushing out of the rows, holding her hand to her chest. I saw a splash of cherry red soaked into her hoodie. Jesus, Daria said, running to help. Oh my God, you're bleeding. Ryan pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and moved towards the girls. What happened? I asked, eyeing the stalks where Greta had come from. Something cut me, Greta said, while Ryan wrapped up her sliced palm. I don't know what. Daria was already pushing through the corn. Carefully, after a few seconds, she called back. You guys should see this. Ryan pushed the strange stalk, wary of where he placed his fingers. Thorns? He asked, pointing at the curved barbs that covered the corn plant from the roots up. They really want you to stay on the path, Greta muttered, pressing her injured hand against her chest. There are more here, I said. Dozens of the thorned stalks were threaded in among the rows. Ryan touched a barb and yanked his hand away. Even a light brush was enough to draw blood. This can't be legal, he said, sucking on the cut. I'm calling OSHA, or whatever the corn equivalent is. Farmers only, Daria suggested. Nobody laughed, not even her. A sudden breeze blew through the field, causing the stalks to bend and ripple. It almost looked like they were reaching for us. The shadow still hadn't left the sun from earlier, and it was much cooler and darker than I would have liked. We should go back to the path, I said. Ryan stood on his tiptoes, trying to see over the rows, but he wasn't even close. I couldn't tell if it was my imagination or if the plants were getting taller. Fine, he agreed. But when we get out of this maze, I'm punching that weird carnival Barker dude right in the kidneys. It was a short walk back to clear ground. From there, we all agreed to just keep taking right turns until we hit a dead end. If that happened, we'd retrace our steps and try left turns. It was a small maze. We could see both entrance and exit from the parking lot. There was no way it would take us more than 30 minutes at most to solve, just by brute forcing it. I lost track of time through the slog of lefts and rights and dead ends, but it was at least an hour, probably 2. Every 10 minutes or so, one of us would try to make a call, but there was never any signal. I'm not sure when the clouds moved in exactly. I didn't notice them while we were trying to keep track of the turns we made, but when I felt the temperature drop, I looked up for the sun and saw only a sky of black clouds, rough as shredded wool. Being lost, all of the weirdness, I think I could have handled it if Greta wasn't so sick. She was getting worse by the minute following her encounter with the thorns hidden in the rows. At first, whatever was wrong with her seemed minor, but it was accelerating. She complained of stiff limbs and joint pain, fatigue, and a deep numbness spreading through her body. Ryan was starting to show signs of being ill too. It wasn't as severe as with Greta, but I had a hunch it was only a matter of time. Daria was clearly having the same concerns. She dropped back to walk next to me, while the others moved ahead, with Ryan carrying Greta and starting to limp. They both need to get to a hospital immediately, Daria whispered. I know. I lifted my phone as high as I could in a vain attempt to catch a signal like a bug in a net. Damn it. Nothing. Do you think it was the plant? Daria nodded. Crazy, though. I've never heard of poison corn, or thorned corn, for that matter. Cawthorn, that's clever, but Ryan stumbled in front of us and fell. He managed to turn and half-catch Greta as they went down. She hit his chest hard. Daria and I both ran up as fast as we could. Ryan was laying on the ground looking winded, but Greta was in a bad way. Her body snapped and convulsed, kicking up dirt and dried corn husks. Neither Daria or I knew what to do, other than to try to keep Greta from hurting herself while thrashing around. Thankfully, the spasms only lasted a minute at most. Then she was still, eyes open but dull. Daria leaned in close to, then jerked back with a gasp. "What?" I asked. "What's wrong?" Daria pointed at Greta's face. I looked closely and saw what caused her reaction. A piece of yellow straw the size of a fingernail was poking out from the corner of Greta's eye. Another length was jutting from a small cut on her cheek. "There's more," Daria whispered, pulling back the sleeve of Greta's hoodie to expose more of the straw pushing through her skin. Oh God, there's so much." Greta never woke up from her seizure. After he recovered, Ryan insisted on carrying her for as long as he could. When his limbs got too stiff, I took over. I carried her for hours, though I didn't know how many. The cloud cover meant that the day became night dark and winter cold. We all walked shivering through the maze, taking turn after turn after turn. I'm not sure when Greta stopped breathing. We were taking a break. Huddled together, Greta leaned between Ryan and I. Straw was bursting through cuts all over her body and sprouting from her eyes and mouth. Something about her staring eyes caused me to press my fingers against her neck, then her wrist, then her neck again more urgently. She had no pulse and wasn't breathing. Ryan gave her CPR for so long, I worried he'd pass out. I heard Greta's ribs crack under the pressure, then another, more horrible sound. It was like a rustling, the sound of compressed straw moving inside of her. Sobbing, Ryan kept trying to bring her back, until Daria and I gently pulled him away. He wanted to bury Greta, but the ground was cold and almost frozen, and we didn't have any tools anyway. Eventually, he draped his flannel shirt over her, like a makeshift shroud, leaving him in his undershirt, despite the cold. I was afraid he would drop from the cold or the poison in him. It was moving slower than it did with Greta, but I could tell from his limp and exhaustion that he would share the same strange fate. Ryan must have known that too, because he stopped suddenly on the path. "I'm going to try to cut through again," he said, not looking back at Daria or I. "Don't follow me. There might be more thorns. Stay here and try to stay warm. If I make it, I'll send help. If you don't hear anything in an hour or two, press on, okay?" "Ryan," Daria began, but he was already moving, stepping into the corn, disappearing in the stalks. The two of us stood, shivering and uncertain. It was getting so dark that we had to use our dying phones as flashlights. We didn't have to wait long for something to happen. Less than a minute later, we heard a scream, and then the sound of running coming from the rows. Ryan burst back onto the maze path, eyes wide and wild, chest heaving. In the corn, faces. And we have to... Ryan's panting was cut short when a hand slithered out from the stalks and grabbed his ankle. It was too dark for me to see the source of the hand from the glow of my phone, but I could just make out pale, too tight skin stretched over long fingers. A second hand emerged from the corn, then another and another, then a dozen or more, all latching onto Ryan. He screamed and struggled until one white palm covered his mouth. Before Daria or I could reach him, the hands dragged Ryan back into the blackness between the stalks. Daria made to follow, but I pulled her back. "We can't," I said. "You know we can't." "So we leave him?" Daria shouted. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Daria hesitated, eyes roaming the shadows in the rows. Ultimately, she didn't chase after Ryan. I kept waiting for a scream, but there was nothing. Only the sound of the breeze rustling the corn, then nothing at all. Somehow the silence was worse than any scream. It was a long time before either of us moved. Daria was the first one to take her eyes away from the spot where Ryan disappeared. She began walking silently forward. I followed her. We kept following the maze. It might have been hours or a few days. Our phones died, so we walked in complete darkness. unable to check them for time, though the clocks in them seemed wrong ever since we originally stepped off the path anyway. We walked and walked and walked and walked, too afraid to go into the rows, too tired to stop trying to find an exit. Compared to how Greta and Ryan met their ends, Daria's death was mundane. That didn't make it any less horrible. I always figured that in a survival situation, hunger was the biggest threat. But it was thirst that got us both, and so damn fast. We kept stumbling and walking got harder and harder. I was thirsty, then viciously thirsty. Then a terrible fog crept into my brain. Daria fell, and I sat next to her. We talked then, though I can't remember what about. I kept going in and out of consciousness. When Daria stopped talking, and then breathing, I pulled myself together enough to lay her on the path and to close her eyes. My hands were shaking. I'm sure I would have cried if my body could spare the water. A sudden searing brightness filled the world. I looked up and saw that the clouds were gone and the sun was out. I glanced down at the path. Daria's body was gone. I was alone. Dazed, I stumbled up from my knees and took in my surroundings. I was still in the maze, but the path was narrower and the corn was shorter. And I could see the exit. The next part I don't remember well, and most of it I was told about later. Apparently, I was found wandering down the highway, dehydrated and sobbing. Some kind Samaritan rushed me to the hospital. Once I was recovered enough to talk to the police. I told them about the maze and my friends. They didn't believe me. Of course they didn't. When they checked the field I sent them to, there was no sign of the Halloween hamlet. All signs of it were gone from the internet when I went looking later. It was like it never existed. Officially, Ryan, Greta, and Daria are still considered missing. The unofficial speculation is that the four of us went on some drug binge in the woods, and they got lost or had accidents or maybe just left. My memories of the strange things in the maze were also chalked up to a bad trip. But I know the truth. I know what took my friends. Who took my friends? These days I'm not doing so great, but I manage. I spend most of my time driving around or online searching for any signs of a carnival or fair going. By Halloween Hamlet. I'll find it again eventually. That's why I keep an axe and a few gallons of gasoline in the trunk of my car. The gas is for the corn maze, for a fire that will burn it down to ashes. The axe is for the creep in the ticket booth. Thank you for staying with me to the end. Remember to subscribe for more scary stories and comment which one was your favorite from the collection. If you want to see more videos, click here.